When I was talking about this conference to a couple of people, actually not one, but I think two of them have said, I'm not going, but if I was going, I would certainly want to see this British historian guy who talks about China. And it's not just a British historian guy, he's actually author of bestseller The Silk Roads, two bestsellers actually, a professor at Oxford of global history at Oxford University. He has been analyzing trends, global trends at Russia, the Middle East, Central Asia, and China long before doing that became popular and started hitting the headlines. He compares the past and the present just to show that the world is now spinning around the Asian spine and has been actually for a long time now. So what are we supposed to do about China? We'll learn that from Peter Frankopan.
Great, well thank you very much indeed, and thank you Anna for a terrific presentation. I met Anna last night and I was up, well not all night, because I read through Factfulness straight away, so if I fall asleep I need some coffee, but it's the perfect prelude, or the perfect joint talk actually, because I'm going to talk about how also we see the world the wrong way round, our assumptions, our expectations, and how we can't spot some of these big trends in front of our eyes. So I'm a historian, and like all historians, I like looking into the future. I believe that if you can try to understand the past, you get things wrong, but you're at least asking the right kind of questions. In most of our lives, actually, the question is as important, sometimes much more important than the outcome. And to show that looking into the future is difficult, no one would have expected that every single person in this room has a mobile device. This is what mobile devices looked like when I was a student. This is what someone who used a mobile device looked like. I don't like him already without even meeting him. That's my projection bias. Or that this is what a laptop would look like, costs $6,000, and has the same capacity as a very, very basic digital watch. Or here, 10 megabyte computer system, only $6,000. Get it now while you can. These trends, these changes, they happen very, very quickly in front of our eyes, that we never ask those questions about the implications of these changes and where they come from. Well, we take everything in our stride much too easily. So, for example, here's a cover of Forbes magazine in 2007. You'll see Nokia, can anybody catch the cell phone king? And 5 years later, Nokia was filing for bankruptcy. Now it's coming back up again, but not as a handset maker. So these changes, they happen very quickly. Change, as Anna said, it happens around us, not just driven by news, not just through the projection bias, but through the very way in which we try and make sense of the world around us. We don't think about what's coming towards us, and when we do, we often draw the wrong conclusions. And to show that, I'll put some people who are much cleverer than me, their predictions to show how difficult it is to guess what the future might bring. So I think there is maybe a world for 5 computers. This is the president of IBM. Well, that turned out to be quite wrong. There's no reason why anyone would want one in their home. This is as recent as 1977. Nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners, on the other hand, these are bound to be in every single household. Well, that's also wrong. And then Bill Gates, who we already saw today, unless his inbox is different to mine, which I suspect it might be, it doesn't look to me like spam will be solved. So guessing the future, it's very difficult. Technology drives things. Climate is playing a role in that, new connections and so on. But I'm going to take you back to the beginning about how we would try to understand what normal even means. Here in Lithuania, in any school anywhere in Europe, the first thing you normally learn about when it comes to history are the ancient Greeks, the originators of democracy, so we're told. We're not told that democracy in city-states actually grew in Mesopotamia, in what's now Iraq, because our assumption is that things that happen in Iraq are bad. When we hear about Athens, no one really asks the question, what went wrong? How did all these very clever scholars, orators, generals, philosophers, scientists, Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and so on, did the Greeks suddenly become stupid? What happened to those schools of knowledge? We don't ask that question. Instead, all we learn is that Rome comes next. And Rome was a global leader. We don't really think too much about why Rome went down the tubes. In fact, heavily connected to climate, to migration, and to the world many of you will be familiar with, getting your business model wrong. Rome, if you have your expenditure suddenly shoot up and your revenue collapse, you don't survive for long. That's what happened to Nokia too. There are lots of lessons we can learn about this. But again, those Roman scholars, we don't think about where they went. We don't think about what happened to Maximus and Russell Crowe after he killed Commodus. It's not absolutely true. It's a great film, though, in Gladiator. But that idea about this center of global change constantly being a rhythm of how the world works. Most people, you in Lithuania will know much better than others, this great city of Ctesiphon, which was the center that paralleled Rome about the same time, 1,500 years ago. This was an engine room for change. For most people, even the name is a complete mystery because we only look at Europe. For us, we think about Rome and then the jump through to the Middle Ages. Merv, in what's now Turkmenistan, was the single biggest inhabited city in the world from the year 800 until 1221, when it was sacked by the Mongols, a victim of its own success. Things that work draw in all sorts of raiders, all sorts of people wanting to try to squeeze and get things out of you. For 500 years, nearly 500 years, this was not just a global center, probably the global center for trade, for brains, for scholars. If we'd been having a conference, we wouldn't have been in Palanga, we'd have been in Merv. And again, it's a city that no one has ever heard of. I'm sure if we did one of Anna's tests, no one could locate this correctly on a map within 1,000 kilometers. Here in Lithuania, you are very fortunate because, like us in Britain, you had once a great empire. And when you have an empire, your horizons expand. So here in Lithuania, your expectations of Poland, of Russia, of what's now Ukraine, of the Black Sea, fits within some sort of framework of what it is that Lithuania once did and once was. And that's extremely important, those expanded horizons, because you see the world in a slightly different way. But again, the different medieval capitals of Lithuania, but Vilnius too, those questions about how did Lithuania become so incredibly successful, a European medieval superpower? How did that happen? And why did it go wrong? And we tend to think it's always that the king and his princesses make the wrong marriage decisions. It's always much, much more complicated than this. But this constant motion of powers rising and falling is one of the great stories of our time. Venice, many of you will have been to, a beautiful city, was the global leader for financial instruments. From about 1200, I suppose, until about 1600. Venice is a beautiful city to go and visit now. Most people's views when they see a city like this is to think, how stupid or rich do you have to be to build a palace on the sea? You don't have to be worried about climate change to understand why that's a bad idea. But how were they so successful? And I will promise you that one day, maybe we're doing quite a good job about it. Very interested to see you cheer that you beat the United Kingdom. We're not doing very well on too much right now. But cities, states, empires, businesses, they all rise and they all fall. They all fall. London has been a global leader. We can argue back exactly since when, maybe 1600, maybe 1650. And today, it is in a much more competitive set with New York, Shanghai, Dubai, etc., etc., etc. Places that do well don't just keep on doing well. It doesn't work that way. That's not how life works. New York, again, a huge metropolis. There will be all sorts of factors that will move these centers of legal, financial, demographic expertise that are part of what, as Anna called it, this global picture of much more fundamental changes. This could be to do with rising sea levels that affects New York. It could be to do with other climate things. It could be political acts. There are all sorts of different variables that explain the rises and falls. It could be the disintegration of states. There are many different explanations, but to assume that there is something called normal and that persists shows how very wrongly we think about history as well as about the world around us. Shanghai, even in the 1940s and 50s, was a relatively modestly sized town, which had a decent port, and now with a population of 23 to 24 million people, with legislation passed by the Chinese government to stop that city getting any bigger. These changes are profound. We don't see them because we are following the news. We're following what's happening here and now. But even in our lifetime, and I'm sure there are lots of people who are very young, I can't see too many in the audience, but even in our lifetimes, in my lifetime, I was still at school when the Berlin Wall came down. The massive reconfiguration of what the Baltic states and Lithuania have looked like, the change in the lifetime of everybody in this room, in the recent lifetime of everybody in this room, it's enormous. We sort of forget that. We forget that in places like Africa, the end of apartheid happened with Nelson Mandela when he became president, in a transition that has fundamentally changed the composition of what it means to be South African and probably even beyond. These are seismic changes. Again, I mentioned cities in China, which is undergoing the fastest period of urbanization and city building in human history. So China between 2011 and 2013 used more concrete than the United States used as a whole in the whole of the 20th century. That process of accelerated change that we don't notice, we don't think about, it's very abstract, it's detachable, it doesn't really affect us wherever we are, in Palanga, in Vilnius, in Oxford, London. We're not connected to it, so it doesn't make any sense to us. We don't think about the fact that there are only 9 cities in the USA that have a population of more than 1 million people. But in China, there are 156 cities with a population of more than 1 million. So if you want to solve climate change, if you want to address digital infrastructure, if you're an exporter or an importer here in Lithuania, you start with your markets. You start with always with demographics and resources. These changes that have happened in our lifetimes are profound. We factor out instability. We think we live in a world of peace. We keep telling ourselves things get better and better, and that sounds fine if you are today in Palanga. That seems reasonable. We forget about the breakup of Yugoslavia. We forget about what Russia may do tomorrow, or China may do tomorrow, or the United States may do tomorrow. As we're here this morning, the potential for global meltdown is acute. What decisions are made this afternoon in the White House about what to do with Iranian drones, or supposedly Iranian drones that have hit a Saudi Arabian facility, might change that rosy picture. It is one butterfly's wings flapping that can change how stable or unstable our global world is. But even on the doorstep of Europe, with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the war in Syria that has been going on since 2012, these changes happen. We read them in the newspaper, but they're meaningless to us because we're unconnected to them. But there are new connections that are being developed all the time, again, out of view. I'll talk about China and the Belt and Road Initiative in a bit. But there are train lines that are being built at massive speed across particularly all of Asia, but also in Africa, providing greater and newer connections that draw people together. And as a historian, I'm interested in exchange. I'm interested in when we meet, not just what do you buy and sell each other, but what ideas do you take away? What kind of questions do people ask? How do you try to understand the world in a better way? These seismic changes have seen states in Central Asia with their enormous mineral resource to build shopping centers in the shape of tents and sails. And here my favorite global autocratic authoritarian leader, the president of Turkmenistan. I'm almost certain those are made of plastic rather than metal. He is an award-winning DJ, horse rider, racing car driver. He never loses a race at anything. And Turkmenistan, with a population of only 5 million people, has the 4th largest gas reserves in the world. Pipelines only flowing in one direction, only flowing to energy markets in China. These important pieces of the global picture we either disconnect with or we focus on the DJing rather than the reality. Now, here's something that I have from Anna's book, in fact, from Factfulness, to show how crazy we are about our conceptions of the world. And the data, you can have a lot of fun, as we had in the first session. But this image I found very striking of how people assume families work. Big families, many children die. It's wonderful that I can use Anna's slide. This is what most people would assume seems to be normal. And as the authors of the book point out, in fact, this is the picture, this was correct in 1965. This is what things actually look like today. There are very few big families being born in other parts of the world, or that shift towards change. And yet we don't notice that. Our projection bias of how we think the world looks like this, many families in poor parts of the world with lots of children because children die, and the reality. And factoring in that reality is extremely significant. As a historian, we mentioned the shift back to a natural axis. Europe is very recent into the story of where has mattered in history. Alexander the Great, the wonderful general who reached India by the time he was 33, and he cried because there was nothing left of the world to conquer. He was a kind of Mark Zuckerberg type, bit needy, brilliant, didn't think through all the consequences. It didn't cross Alexander the Great's mind to head for Lithuania or the Baltic states, or for the south of France, or for Tuscany, all those nice bits that we think, or Germany, the manufacturing heart of Europe. For the Greeks, the thing that mattered was Asia, because of its natural resources, first, and its demographics, second, and third, because of the sophistication of its culture. This is where threats came from, this is where opportunities lay. It was always all about Asia. The Romans knew this too, so the Romans, in fact, building these trade networks that look a little bit like maps of the new Silk Roads that are rising, the wonderful city of Rome, eventually moved the capital of Rome to a brand new city called New Rome. It was soon being nicknamed the city of Constantine, Constantinopolis, the emperor who founded it, and now modern Istanbul, to move Rome closer to the action, to the challenges, and to the opportunities. Because even today in Europe, we can forget we don't really have anything here that anybody wants. Gold, almost none in Europe, little bit of oil in the North Sea, little bit of gas, a little bit of silver. But the things in the past that mattered, spices, silks, luxury goods, gold, lapis for that wonderful art, the dark blue, lay in the east. And even in fact today in Asia, 65% of the world's wheat is grown east of Istanbul. 70% of the world's fossil fuels, whether we can disengage from them or not, let's hope so, 70% lie east of Istanbul. 85% of the world's rice is grown east of Istanbul. And more than 95% of the world's rare earths, those things that we're going to need for new batteries, for clean technologies, including for solar panels, computers, etc., 95% located in either China or Mongolia or Central Asia. So we don't have much to offer to bring to that party, apart from clever people, apart from rule of law. But clever people and the rule of law, despite what many of us in this room think, are neither a European invention, nor do we have a monopoly on being nice people, which is what we tend to think. We tend to think that Europeans are more civilized, more open, more tolerant, because that suits our story. And it doesn't need to take much to look into the 20th century to say that our story in the 20th century was far, far worse than almost any other part of the world. With the Holocaust, with 2 world wars, with the suffering of the Russian Revolution and the persecutions that have come as a result. Europe's best single thing we've had over the last 1,000 years has been our propensity towards violence. That's how Europeans built empires globally. That's how Europeans managed to subjugate other people through our use of technology to extract resources and divert them back to Europe. And in this post-empire world, where we're much more interested in being democrats, in listening to each other, in allowing people to have different views and tolerances about sexuality, gender, religion, all those wonderful things that make us feel proud to be European, is a massive competitive disadvantage. And it's a real challenge when we deal with other parts of the world. So the world has always kept on moving. These connections of the Silk Roads of the past brought all these commodities, these exchanges, these people together. We don't spend a great deal of time thinking about them, but even when it comes to our global religions, none of them are European. You know, we forget that Jesus Christ was born in the Middle East. He spoke Aramaic, and there's a wonderful YouTube video you can see of a Texas senator. In Texas, they have a very high number of Hispanic speakers. A discussion in the Texas Senate about whether children should have to learn Spanish as well as English in school. And on a very hot day, pointing at the people in listening to him, saying, if the English language was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the citizens of Texas. When you don't understand where you come from, you don't understand history, you don't understand that Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism all grow in this center of the world. They spread, they compete, they're all trying to answer the same kinds of questions. And in fact, Christianity spread much more quickly eastwards than it did westwards. There was an archbishop in Samarkand, a bishop in Kashgar in China, before there was the first bishop in Britain, before there were the first Christians in Scandinavia or in the Baltics. Christianity was not a European thing. It's just because the Pope is based in Rome we think so. Even Lithuania, the reason why we're here is because of these trade routes and connections to Asia. So the Scandinavians and those from these parts of the world would travel down the Russian river systems and Ukrainian river systems and through Poland and through the Baltics to deliver, to trade with silver-rich, highly urbanized, sophisticated economy. We would today call them developed economies in places like the Abbasid Great Arab Empire and in the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. And that trade was so intensive that eventually traders started to build fortified communities in places like Kiev, in Novgorod, eventually places in Belozero and in Vilnius too. The origins of the cities of the Baltic are directly connected not just to trade with Scandinavia and trade locally with Russia, but this long-distance experience, which was why Lithuania was so successful in building an empire. Now that shift dramatically towards centering Europe at the middle of the world was connected to the discovery, or European so-called discovery of the Americas, and almost about exactly the same time, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, finding a way by sea to India. And that suddenly connected Europe into the middle of the geography of the continents, at least when you look at the map from here, from our European perspective. This is not how a map looks like if you're Australian. Amazingly, it's not just Europe that's put in the middle. But that allowed Europe to have its advantages of bringing things back into Europe, fueling the great building booms that made Europe powerful and a global leader. Now, I talked about how recent some of these changes are. That just covers the last few hundred years. But to show the pace of change, this is the Asian share, the emerging 7 countries like China, the Philippines, etc., Indonesia, large size population bases, growing economies. In 1990, this is roughly the scale of their global GDP compared to the G7. This is how it looked in 2014, and most projections put it at somewhere between 65 and 70% by 2050. That doesn't mean that we're slowing down, doesn't mean we're doomed here in Europe or in the Western developed economies, but it means that other countries are becoming richer, they're becoming faster. So in 2017, for example, what's striking about these fastest growing economies in the world, not one of them is based in the Western Hemisphere. There are lots of different explanations for individual countries on this list. You'll notice that China is not one of the fastest growing, despite what we all assume. But that process of change is happening in front of our eyes at massive speed. So the Bund in Shanghai, the growth of the city over the course of 20 years. The urbanization, as I mentioned, the pace of change of the number of Chinese tourists traveling to, well, all over the world, you can see over the course of less than 10 years, from 45 million to 130 million people. That means that when you go into a hotel lobby, when you go to a restaurant, when you go to a football match, the colors that people are wearing, the food that's on offer, the music that's being played in the lift is being shaped by where the market is. And if this is what these trends show, then adapting to it, preparing for it, understanding it is important. Already, the Chinese tourists outbound spend more than American tourists abroad globally. And in 1990, the amount of spend globally by Chinese outbound tourists was precisely 0. In the same way, the statistics on what has happened just in China alone are enormous. So 800 million people lifted out of poverty. It depends exactly what poverty means. We argue a lot about what the poverty line means, how relative it is. It's a notional number, but that process of change has been highly dramatic. And to show that, the size of China's economy in 2001, entry to the WTO, 1 trillion, and now 14 trillion and rising. That's in the course of less than 2 decades, a multiplication by 14 times. The Chinese luxury market currently has more than a third of all luxury products are bought by Chinese consumers. So your Prada shoes, your Gucci jackets, your Chanel outfits and fragrances are not being shaped by what markets want in the Baltics or in Moscow or in New York or Los Angeles, but by what people want in Beijing, in Chongqing, in Shanghai. And to show that, in the city of Xi'an, which is an important city, it's very well known as a sort of gateway city to the ancient Silk Roads, Prada Group last year opened 9 stores in one city, just in the city of Xi'an. So this is where opportunities lie as well as everything else. And just to remind you, in 1990, it wasn't necessarily the most advisable thing to come back to China at that time with Prada bags if you managed to go abroad, because you were a state official on state business, and this stuff has always been expensive. It's not just China, by the way. This is about Asia knitting together, both because of demographics and rising wealth. So global air travel is going to double by 2036. Almost none of that is driven by Western economies, or the United States, North America, and Europe. Almost all of it by what's happening in Asia, these large populations. And if anybody is wanting a new job or to retrain, there is a chronic global shortage today of Boeing 737 pilots. And Xiamen Air, one of the Chinese regional airlines, has reported starting salaries for Boeing 737 pilots at $750,000 per year, right? Because the market always catches up with reality. That growth of Chinese GDP, you can see that red hockey stick that startups like to show about how they're going to grow. This is the reality in front of us right now. And there are all sorts of different models of how things might change, but even the baseline scenario shows a trebling of per capita income over the course of the next 30 years, which is, or 40 years rather, 30 years, yes, which is astonishing. 40 years, thank you, which is astonishing. And the high level potentially a 6 times multiple. A lot depends on China's projections. Understanding other places, paying attention to them, is quite important. We don't do that, by the way, because no one learns about these things in school. No one learns about them in university. In my country, the United Kingdom, population of 60 million, we have annual year groups of about 800,000 students taking their final exams at age 17 and 18. We have in the United Kingdom this year 300 students studying Chinese. That's it, at undergraduate level. Right? There are fewer people today studying Arabic or Russian in the United Kingdom than there were 30 years ago. Failing to pay attention to all this stuff, it seems to me striking. It's not just China, it's also about other countries in Asia with big population bases and sudden rapid growth. Since 1990, 2 million households then had disposable incomes of more than $10,000 a year. Now there are 50 million households that can do that. The consumption expenditure is multiplying by 3 times in the course of 8 years. And that puts pressure on us here too. It's not just opportunities for our businesses, it's also about what does that do to prices of commodities that will then become more unaffordable for us. That will then stratify our own societies. It will lead to a sharpening of the divide between rich and poor. And that challenge about social inequality and financial inequality is the current driving story of European politics. The gap between the rich and poor, and that is being accelerated by consumption patterns in other parts of the world that we don't pay any attention to, as I said. So Pakistan, that no one will spend any time studying at school or university, has a population roughly of 200 million people. Disposable income in Pakistan has doubled in the course of 8 years. And last year, Pakistan was the fastest growing retail economy in the world. For lots of reasons, partly because young people don't trust their politicians. I was going to say we're very lucky in Europe, but that's a different story. They don't trust their politicians, and they don't trust the banking system. So people don't save if you're young. You want to have fun now because you believe that your money might disappear, might be taken off you. You don't think it'll be invested properly, so you spend and enjoy yourself while you can. So all around us, we see these massive, huge changes in terms of the growth of revenues and of user bases. Facebook's entire model is about getting Asia right. So has been Google's. Google the slogan of Google used to be do good. And they dropped that quietly last year because Google has been working on a new browser, codenamed Dragonfly, which is acceptable to the Chinese censor. And using Dragonfly, you are unable to find search terms like human rights, like Hong Kong protests. And a company that set out to do good and use that as its slogan now understands that if shareholders want to get their return, their optimal return, then accommodations need to be made. And those may not be in the same interests of Google users or of global citizens. But these new changes, these new parallels, this new world coming towards us, it's almost indescribable unless you are following it carefully. New cities are being built. Astana, now called Nur-Sultan in Kazakhstan, is younger than Google as a city. Right, that's really saying something. The capital of oil-rich Kazakhstan. The airport in Baku looks much better than Gatwick or Heathrow. Ashgabat, amongst all of his wonderful other skills, the president is a former dentist, so all the buildings in Ashgabat need to be white, and they are cleaned every single day. It's a repressive state. And then all of you, but we know a little bit about that. Everybody hears about Dubai. Some people go to Dubai and they say they're actually on balance rather live in Vilnius. But it's not just a choice. It's about where markets, people, commodities, goods, action happens. It's fine to live in the countryside. That picture that Anna showed of an idyllic country setting, that's great if that's how you want to live. But if you want to be wealthy, if you want to be educated, if you want to have better access to things, there's only so much that technologies can do to bring us together. In fact, these changes of how people live, like in Bangalore, India's IT capital, they are changes that are happening in real time, have already happened. Bangalore, in fact, has run out of water. It has to bring in more than 10 million gallons of water every single day. And the Indian authorities say by 2025, Bangalore will be exhausted as a city. The collapse of cities. And as a historian, I'll tell you that cities, they do collapse if you get your environmental sustainability wrong. We hear about Iran in the press and how awful the Revolutionary Guard are and the mullahs and so on. But last year, here's a property in Iran that was sold for $25 million, which sounds to me quite a lot of money for a state that we think must be regressive, and we don't assume that has any business experience or world at all. And in the world that everywhere we look, we see these new connections coming together. All these football teams, my team, Chelsea, owned by a Russian with his money coming from oil and minerals from Siberia and Central Asia. Every single professional football team in Birmingham owned by Chinese. The champions of Europe owned by the Abu Dhabi family, royal family. Paris Saint-Germain by the Qatari royal family. In the old days, it used to be Europeans who would go to Italy on holiday and buy the contents of a palace or of a church and bring it home. It used to be called the Grand Tour. Now, it's the supercars being brought from Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or wherever for young men particularly to come and have fun and do things in Europe or in the States that they shouldn't do back home. That idea of how do you spend your money if you've got more than you can count, well, why not buy a football team? Buy things that are fun. This is the reality of where we are. These new connections that are being pushed together, the Belt and Road Initiative is by far the most important one of those, first announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013, funnily enough, in Astana in Kazakhstan, and it's a very vague term to capture all sorts of different kinds of connections and investments to do with transport, energy, security. There are Belt and Road initiatives to do with oral and dental hygiene. There is Silk Road that now extend into outer space. It's a very fluid term, and as a historian, I don't mind that. The disjointedness of what you can force into one label can be very, very useful. And China's been very careful to bring along all of its next-door neighbors, explaining to them that Europeans colonized, they enslaved, they took resources away, and China doesn't have a history of doing that. There's a discussion one can have around that, but there's some truth in the idea that China has been a trading nation that hasn't, apart from with its own current territorial borders, expanded beyond. So the Belt and Road Initiative, from a Chinese perspective, is trying to do more than just facilitate exchange. In fact, the kind of language that's used around it, like on the screen behind, it's about world peace. It's about stability. It's about saying that there is a different way to volatile American interventions and rhetoric around the world. And there are endless maps that will show what kind of connections. It's a big, broad basket of projects. And I know here in Lithuania, this is something that you think and talk about too. That consolidation of Asia is not straightforward. There are lots of local rivalries. There are lots of rivalries between individuals. There are lots of tensions. There are lots of worries and concerns. There's negative stories about what might be the case. But when you compare the language of cooperation around what we see in Europe, where we have all sorts of pressures on what Europe even means, both from an EU point of view, we know that in the UK, but even in terms of what Europe should mean in the future, which direction we're going. We can shake hands with each other, but the reality is it's not just the crazy people in England who think Brexit's a good idea. Rather, all over Europe we see deteriorating views of the EU, to the point that in a survey done earlier this summer, 58% of people in France don't believe that the European Union will survive beyond the next 10 to 20 years. And this sort of stuff is terrifying. You in Lithuania have had experiences of what collapse and pressure look like, that normality of how things do unpick themselves, about when you lose control of the story, when in the case of the Soviet Union, you lose your ability to repress too many people all at the same time. But there are fundamental changes of what is happening in Europe around us too. And the story is not great. In surveys done earlier this year about ideas about democracy, most young people, if you see the charts here, the spike at the bottom, people born in the 1980s do not believe that democracy is a fundamental necessity for established state. This is terrifying. We find young people who think that parliaments should be bypassed, that lawmakers shouldn't be necessarily bound by convention and by law. And this process is something that's extremely dangerous when it comes to working out how do we work together with different states. The engagement with China is a real challenge for sure. The idea that Europe and its naivety is over is all very well to say that, but the reality of what's happening is huge. The odds look pretty bad for us, says Merkel. Europe is stuck between the US on the one hand and China on the other. And here on the eastern edge of the EU, in the Baltics, the concern about what decisions are being made by Brussels, because the policy decisions are driven by Washington and Beijing, and that push back towards re-enabling and reopening ideas with Russia, who've invaded Ukraine and been involved in all sorts of destabilizing operations against established democracies in the UK, in the US, and indeed elsewhere. It's a hugely significant challenge for us all to work out how to respond. That's not helped by the fact that in the White House at the moment we have a president who speaks in highly aggressive, volatile terms, but an American establishment that sees that we are at some kind of, you talk about tipping points, this is the reality of what matters in the world today. The United States categorization of China as a systemic threat to the United States. There are congressmen and senators earlier this summer who said that China is a worse competitor than the Soviet Union ever was, and China's ultimate aim is the destruction of the United States of America. That in turn drives military calculations that you can see now, declassified earlier this year, models by the US military for what a conventional war with China would do to global trade and global GDP. So we find the splintering of the West, where the slogan of America's foreign policy, as one White House insider put it, is "We're America, bitch." That way that the United States feels it is willing and able to drop out of Paris Peace Accords, to come out of the Trans-Pacific Partnerships and so on, to find a way of protecting its own interests, in many ways is totally logical. It seems to me logical that Trump is trying to level the playing fields with tariffs with China and trying to find ways of engaging in ways that are not just about trade, but that will have a direct impact on consumers around the world. So right now, the number of products, I just picked shoes, for example, because they are cross-social spectra. The trainer is ubiquitous, whether you're rich or poor. The cost is going to go up, in some cases, by 65%. And already JP Morgan thinks that the trade wars of the US and China are adding $1,000 to the household expenditure of every single household in the United States. Those kinds of pressures of the world right in front of us right now. And the expectation of slowing down global growth, because we live in a connected and interconnected world, it's not just about China against the US, it's about our global community coming under pressure with all of that. As it so happens, the consolidation because of the pressures coming from the US in particular, is a consolidation and connections between China and Iran and Russia as part of that global story. Here's President Putin about to give President Xi, who Xi calls Putin his bosom buddy, the best friend a man could ever have, giving him his favorite Russian ice cream as President Xi's birthday present earlier this year. These ways in which Asia is forming together, finding ways to define itself as not being European, not being Western, not being willing to listen to sanctions and demands made in Brussels or in London or in Washington to find these new connections. And the United States take these countries as a single entity, forces of instability, which prompts further discussions. Now, I was very interested to read the latest security review here in Lithuania about the challenges that face Lithuania. And of course, as you'd expect, Russia is the dominant theme and the dominant story, as one would understand for all sorts of very obvious reasons. But this year is the first year that China has also been mentioned as a security issue, ranging for the defense forces, the security agencies, and so on. And the question will be, what kind of expectation is there for China within the Baltics, which I'm sure you'll want to ask about. And Lithuania's NATO membership, its EU membership offer obvious gateways, as does the strategic location that your country has in terms of what's on offer, and membership formally of the 16+1, a group brought together by China that picks off countries in Central Eastern Europe to treat them in a different way and to explain that there are ways in which these countries that were on the poorer side of Europe, thanks to the Cold War, can find benefits, dialogue, potential investment as a result through participation in the Belt and Road that your government has signed up to, and also Chinese interest in strategic assets, because within the Belt and Road there are specific themes around deep water ports, cargo container ports, infrastructure like trains, like digital technologies around Huawei, you'll have seen in the press all about that. But this world that we live in, we look at the wrong way round. We start from Europe and expect everyone wants to become more like us. It doesn't seem to me that that is the case. It seems to me that we've been learning all the wrong lessons from history by staring at our own image in the mirror and admiring it rather than paying attention to people all around us. So on that note, I'll stop for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, obviously, we want to ask about the national threats that China is posing. I think there is little discussion in the public, but very recently, the president, for example, has mentioned that there might be some unwanted political influence with strategic investments that China wants to do. Espionage was acknowledged as a national threat. Looking from the historical perspective, how concerned should we actually be?
Well, there are two ways of answering it. One is you can guess, and one is you can do your homework and learn about it. So there are different questions, I think, underneath this. So one is if, Lithuania in private companies, the state can take investment from anywhere, right? They can turn down investment from anywhere. But it would seem to me like when we buy a house, you want to be comfortable with the bank that will treat you the best possible way. And the best way to get those best possible terms is to talk to lots of people. And the weakest point is if you only have one person who's willing to talk to you. And China is very mobile. It's very willing to invest large sums of money, quite often on quite soft terms. But if you don't want to have Chinese investing in Klaipėda, then there are all sorts of alternatives. But if other people don't want to do that, as the Prime Minister of Cambodia puts it, he says lots of people arrive in Phnom Penh, particularly from Europe, with lots of ideas, but the only ones who come with ideas and money is China. I think one has to think very carefully through what are the strategic implications of this, and not to fall into the hysteria of assuming that empires are being built in a way that they're not. Clearly, for Lithuania's perspective, energy dependency on Russia is the single biggest challenge. And I know that this week, despite building the LNG port, liquefied natural gas is coming by ship from Siberia to reach Lithuania to keep Lithuania's energy grid moving. So we can forget, I think, and prioritize the wrong threats. It would seem to me, from a perspective of Lithuania, China really is quite a long way away, and that the risks of port investment are not particularly high. When it comes to digital things, that's a slightly different story, but it doesn't need me to tell you that we assume that harvesting of data by China is bad, which it might well be, but we think that harvesting of data by our own security services and by Facebook is okay. And in fact, yesterday it turns out that Facebook, which has been enabling your Bluetooth use on your mobile phone without your authorization, or that's in the terms and conditions, not to track you, but to track other users who are nearby to where you are. So data is a big challenge, and a war requires a much deeper level of investigation rather than thinking that China must be by default dangerous and bad, which is the general assumption, which is deeply rooted in ideas about race and xenophobia and fear.
We'll actually have a Vice Minister of Defense speaking here this afternoon, so he's going to talk about these cyber threats too. Would there be anyone else in the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Raise your hands and we'll be available. Is there a hand or not? I just want to go back to Anna's presentation and say that she has basically said that we should feel, happier about ourselves. And you say that in Europe, we basically have nothing that anybody wants. How many countries do you think are rubbing their hands that we are going through such a big identity crisis? I don't want to specifically mention Brexit. You did once, but you know what I mean.
I can handle it, yeah. It's a great question, but it's a product of how we are taught history and geography at school. Countries are not competitive. I mean, it's on a football pitch maybe, but how Lithuania does genuinely has no impact, positive or negative, on balance, positive in the UK. And likewise, if we have Brexit, unless there's a direct implication on Lithuania, you're great if your next door neighbours start to get rich and do well. So there's no sort of competition between states. So I think that we assume that people rub their hands when they look at us and think, great, those Europeans are going to fall on their knees. I think that the more fundamental question is, it's a very good quote made by a king of a northwestern region of China 2,500 years ago, who says that the ways of yesterday are not good enough for the world of today and for tomorrow. And this starts with education. This starts by working out what is it the next generation of leaders, of teachers, of social workers, of doctors should know about in our schools and our universities. And in fact, this is a genius idea, to be certifying, forcing people to do the test again and again and again, so that they are aware what these global trends are. They might not understand them. It might be one can always go deeper. But I can promise you, if I was to ask anybody in this room, highly successful, or you wouldn't be here, very engaged, or you'd have gone for coffee, I saw two people in the front row go for coffee, I will bet you that no one in this room can tell me the name of a single Chinese emperor in history. Forget about a good one or a bad one. One. Or who is the biggest film star in India or Pakistan or Nigeria, combined cinema audiences of 2 billion people. And maybe 1 or 2 people have got sort of strained interests. But we are completely disconnected from other parts of the world. And that looks to me that we are narcissistic at best, and it looks to me dangerous at worst. And I was brought up to be taught, despite I'm here today talking, to try to listen and to learn how to respect other people. And what when I used to study the history of Russia, Soviet Union, where you go wrong is when you are insistent and you forget that ability to listen. And I think we in Europe are good people by and large. We educate well, we look after our poor, we look after the weak in society. We could always do it better. But we've got a lot that we should be pleased about, and all those trends of how many more people can read, relative levels of poverty that are stuck a little bit, but it's all plenty of good news there. But we are completely failing to follow, understand, learn, and think about other parts of the world. And so when you say to your defense minister today, I don't know if he's here, I'd love to have coffee.
Vice Minister, he's there at the back.
Great, I'd love to have coffee. The right thing is, what are the right questions to ask, and what are you basing that research on? And the single most telling line in the Brexit discussions wasn't whether we leave and so on. It was a senior cabinet minister who said, we've had enough of experts. And I'm not too proud to say that I might be wrong about everything, and I don't have any problem about being challenged. But when you just discard people and you rely on your instincts, that stops humans from being what distinguishes us from other animals. Our capacity, our difference from those chimpanzees, that we don't have to rely on guesswork. But what Anna showed much clearer than I do, if you do it on guesswork, you're going to get it wrong much, much more often than if you just close your eyes and throw a dart. And that should be terrifying. It's terrifying when you think of global megatrends. That's even more terrifying when it comes to what should the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, what should it invest in? What should it be preparing for? How should it try to prepare for what its challenges and opportunities are of the future? Because if you don't have expertise, if you don't spend time thinking about it, your answer is guesswork. And guesswork is not just right a third of the time, it's right much less than that. Terrifying.
So if I listen to you carefully enough, in the great sweep of history, Brexit, insignificant.
Completely irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. And it's wonderful in a way. It proves the point that you open any newspaper today in anywhere in Europe and it fills the pages. But if you are living in Chongqing with 30 million people, or in Mumbai with 23 million people, or in Abu Dhabi, or in Saudi Arabia, or in sub-Saharan Africa, or in Mexico City, or in Rio de Janeiro, what some idiot prime minister does or doesn't do, it is absolutely meaningless. From a European perspective, it's significant. How do things go right? Do they go wrong? What's clear, if Britain leaves, it's not going to be easily, is it? But these questions about what the EU is, there is a logic to what it is that Brexit is trying to do. It's trying to say that we are under such significant pressure. Aren't we better off going on our own? And as I've said to cabinet ministers in Britain, I'm sure you've all seen the film Titanic. On balance, that guy and Kate Winslet should have got on the lifeboat. But if you jump onto a door, you can still survive. But you're better off making a safer decision. And I've said that like a wild animal, we're safer in a pack than trying to go alone. But unfortunately, the people I talk to in the UK are so convinced that because Britain once had an empire, that this will come back again. So in a way, the greatest thing that you have for you in Lithuania is that you had an empire, but it was long enough ago for you to have got over it.
We like to keep bragging, though, that we once did have an empire. It's very interesting listening to you. I hope someone is lucky enough to talk to you over lunch or coffee. I hope you have that coffee with the Vice Minister of Defense. There's lunch now. We'll come back here in an hour. If you're considering where to go, always come back to this venue. All of the most important stuff happens there. And let's take a minute now to thank Peter Frankopan. Thank you.